We're here in Gillett Square in Dalston in Hackney in London, and this was a really early regeneration project. The idea was to create a public room or space in an area that didn't have a lot of public space, and it's gone on to become a really diverse piece of city. Since then, we've had all kinds of squares developed across London. A lot of them were privatized spaces. This is not a very public space, and it's about to be redeveloped again. So it seemed important to come here and to think about how it's become a space for the community, how it's used, and what is going to be lost or gained through this redevelopment.
This is not the normal thing for a town centre in terms of the anodyne mainstream developer image. If a private sector gets hold of it, this area could be bought out if the planners and if the community allow this to happen. And this is what we're really trying to hang on to, is that there's something very, very precious here, which is celebrated all over the world, which actually plays a very important part in the whole of this area and its community, and we need to hang on to it.
So here we are in Gillett Square on a cold November afternoon. The story starts quite a long time ago. The square is the culmination of a whole process of incremental regeneration, building development, that the organisation that I used to run, Hackney Cooperative Developments, started on way back in the 1980s in Bradbury Street, and it's just off the Kingston High Street in Dalston. And what we're looking at here is both sides of Bradbury Street. Come the 1980s, after the Brixton and Dalston riots, funding, which was the first tranche of state funding for regeneration, came in, and my organisation, which was a small cooperative development organisation supporting co-ops, black and ethnic minority businesses and female entrepreneurs, bid into the council and the GLC, the Greater London Council, to renovate this street.
So at the weekends, this was a complete no-go zone, full of crime and drug dealing, and so the first thing was, so the back of the building was quite dangerous and all wired up, and partly by putting the walkways on, that was almost like, so that when so there was eyes on the street, either Oscar Newman or Janie Jacobs, and so there was this whole thing about turning around, and that was seen as the first step towards making it a more publicly accessible place.
The first phase just simply rehabbed these buildings, sticking to the original form, which was individual housing with shops down below. But by the 1990s, it was a short life rehab. It was falling apart, and support for co-ops in London was failing. And this moment was saved from complete dereliction by the arrival of European funding in this area, which, along with the regeneration budget, the City Challenge, which was the first stage of the government's regeneration initiative, we bid to have another go at this street on a longer-term basis.
One of the reasons why it came to our attention was because there was quite a heated moment where the public were protesting the development plans for the square. Because of that political situation, a lot of people haven't wanted to speak on camera about what's happening here. There's some uncertainty about what's going to happen to the traders. And a lot of this is due to the fact that Dalston has become a much richer place, a much more expensive place to live. It's been rapidly gentrifying and changing. And this space, however, is by regeneration standards almost historic, because it was really one of the first to be redone using European money and a very public spirit, publicly minded program.
What we did, we worked with Hawkins Brown, who were very entrepreneurial architects with an interest in not-for-profits. We came across this idea of putting this round building at the front, which serves as basically the entrance area for the entire street on this side. This series of individual buildings have been amalgamated, and all the staircases in this street were eliminated, and instead of staircases what we got was deck access, which if we come right round you'll see these 2 stories of deck access, and this was completed in about 1997. At that time, what you're looking at now wasn't here at all. This was a car park in a pretty derelict stage, and even in those days it was a place where drinkers came, and it was a sort of pretty rough area. The next stage in this incremental development process was, again, with a lot of public sector funding, and I think this is very important to emphasize. All this depends on very significant amounts of public funding. What you're looking at here are the market pods. They came in 1999, and they actually are much celebrated. Again, the architects, Hawkins Brown, same architects we work with.
They were built in the shipyards in Hull, and a young architect, Andy Puncher, did it, and he's from Hull, and he said, oh, I know where they can be built, and they had all the electrical connections and a concrete slab, and they appeared in a day. They appeared overnight. They came down on the back of trucks, and they literally got plumbed in.
So I wanted to do a study about the market pods because I wanted to find out why they'd been so successful, to the extent that thousands of people came out in protest against their removal or replacement as part of the plans to redevelop the south side of the square. What I did was I started talking to the traders themselves, finding out about their backgrounds, about their businesses, how long they'd been trading here, where else that they'd had businesses. And then I also asked them to give me a tour of their pod to find out kind of how they'd made the space their own. What's really striking is just how different each pod is, given that they're exactly the same shape, exactly the same structure, how each trader has kind of customized it to make that space work for them.
They were very successful. They won the Design Week Award for 2001, and they beat the Tate Modern. They cost £250,000. The Tate Modern project was 10 million, and it was celebrated as a real example of community-based regeneration.
And what was great about them is that they won all sorts of awards, and that I think we won Retail Space of the Year award, which was they beat a massive fit out of several airports and Amsterdam Airport, and several very posh fit outs of the V&A and the National History Museum. But these won.
So what's really interesting about the pods is that they have this window as the main site of interaction between the trader and the visitor instead of a door. So when you look at a shop and there's a door, walking through the door is actually quite an active thing to do, and you're walking into the shop space, you're walking into the shop owner's space. There's a certain kind of commitment in some ways that you need to make in order to be there, whereas a window is a much more friendly interaction because you're not actually entering the space, you're still on the outside looking in. So it's more friendly, it's easier, and also it allows you to sort of be in the space without feeling like there is a commitment to buy or be involved. Unlike a market stall, what we have here is a structure that they don't have to take down and put up every day, and that lends itself to a certain permanence. So they are here, they can continue to kind of build on what they've done before over time, make it exactly the way that they want it, and make it their own. So given this sort of natural extension of the inside space into the square, it's no surprise that when you ask the traders what their if they have any concerns or frustrations, it is about the square itself and the cleanliness of the square, as well as regular policing of the square to make sure that it's safe and clean and pleasant for everyone to be in. And when you think about it, I mean, they spend more time in this square than anyone. And so it's not just a matter of this being having an impact on their business, but it's very much about their own well-being as people as well.
Small businesses, seed businesses could come in here and trade from here. Very low cost and giving an opportunity for small businesses, particularly black and ethnic minorities, to start up in business. Many of them whom are still here, some have moved on, and they're very much in demand. Amazingly, they're nearly 20 years old, they're in very good condition. They've been well cared for. They're in such good nick, they could go for another 25 years now with they're properly maintained. And of course, they are now under threat of demolition. All these buildings were owned or are still owned ultimately by the local authority, but we got virtual freehold on this at a peppercorn rent. So really, the whole ethos of this is to provide, and the calculations that were done here was genuinely affordable workspace. And that was based not on some percentage of the market, which is what the affordability means now. It was actually based on the realities of the businesses that we were targeting, what they could afford, and then the gap between what they could afford and what it cost to build would be subsidized by public funding. That was the old calculation. It was called the city grant calculation, and that's meant about 70% of the costs of building these were publicly funded. And that meant that you could genuinely have people, the target beneficiaries, people who are suffering a social and economic exclusion, could actually come here and start their businesses, which has proved to be very successful. Vortex Jazz Club came in here as one of the primary tenants. They came in at the early design stage, so they are lead tenants. And upstairs there are some arts organisations. The studio upstairs does work with artists with mental health difficulties, and at the top floor there's a design studio. We formed what was called the Gillett Square Partnership, which was the view that this could become, on the back of a major development on this north side, this would allow for a square to be built here, which had been in fact in our mission ever since 1994. And that was in about 2001-2, and in 2003 Ken Livingstone's GLC, under the auspices of the Architecture and Urbanism Unit, which Richard Rogers ran, had this project for 100 new urban spaces across London. They selected this space as the first. It was quite amazing. We had all these top architects, people like Jan Gale, walking around here, and Richard Rogers and so on. And so what happened was that they adopted it and brought in some money and worked with us to get more money from central government to build a square here.
At one stage, the square was going to run all the way across, and would have been posher is probably a bit of a lazy word, but more civic. But actually we couldn't raise the money to do all of it. And I think a lot of this is good luck in some ways. And I think ourselves, and particularly Adam, have worked out that in the long run, the fact that there's people parking their cars and there's a business where they clean the cars here, it actually has always kept a certain amount of life and a bit of the eyes on the street. It sort of gently polices that here. And you can see people leaning along, and it's a sort of bit of activity. And somehow it's always worked better half and half. I mean, in the long run, it might all be a square, but actually it works fine as half a square. And maybe it would have been too pristine and too big a scale, and actually it works fine the way it is. And it's loved.
Now the idea was, the central idea, was that this would be a square that went right to the north side, and that on the north side there would be a 5-storey or 6-storey housing development with a library coming in at the bottom. You can't really have a successful public square with a cultural venue of the sort that we've got here if you have a lot of housing on the side of it.
We got planning for what we thought was a tower at the time. It was 7 stories high. So that was terribly high at the time here. And then one of the recessions stopped it, and it never happened. So maybe again we were lucky. and maybe that would have been too residential, and at night they'd have got upset, maybe, you know, then they'd have stopped the activities in the square, and it would have become too, you know, too cleaned up and gentrified.
Just want to go back to something quite important about the square, which is
Yes.
this deck, because one of the things that triggered the whole vision for a square here was this open deck, which meant that people here, this is a viewing platform. This is like turning this place, this space, into a theatre, where these are the balconies. And all sorts of things happen on these balconies, as well as the businesses going about their everyday business. People come out, and there's a relationship between the people standing on the balconies and the people in the square. So this whole relationship develops a sense of space. When this square was launched, we had 200 saxophonists in the square, half of whom came out of all the doors.
Everything happens here. Table tennis, Turkish football matches, people have weddings and birthday parties here, ping pong tournaments, a lot of music, and Adam's over the years organised the National Theatre come here and do Shakespeare or something a couple of summers, and unfortunately also to prove its democracy, when there was rioting in the streets of Hackney 3 years ago now, they collected here. And then went down their street and looted all the shops. But that's proof that it's the proper democratic place.
So the square was built, the master plan was by Hawkins Brown, Whitelaw Turkington did the detailed design. The whole point about the square is that people might complain that it's kind of empty. I mean, it happens to be empty of people today, but that's not by any means the norm. It is on a cold Sunday afternoon, but it's like a stage. In other words, there aren't fixed bits of sculpture to get in the way. It can be transformed in many different ways, and it has been a theatre and remains a theatre for both spontaneously generated. If you come here in the summer in the evening, you can hardly move for the endless performance art going on one way or another, generated by all the local people and people who come from miles here, but also lots of actually planned events. And there have been many events working with lots of local artists, dance people, carnival groups. Larger organisations like the Barbican Arts have done a whole series of events here, and there have been spontaneous events like on the Day of the Dead and so on, where suddenly you find 2,000 people in the square here. So it's basically a tabula rasa. Anything can happen, and anything does happen here, and there's just very few things which are placed here permanently. You've got the bench, which has been used by the skateboarders. It's pretty worn. And you've got these trees. Some people thought, oh, there should be a lot more trees in here, but actually this is hard surface stuff, but we do have some very nice trees. And this decking here is a sort of permanent stage where people sit. People do often sit on these steps as well. And then again down here we have 2 more trees, and the containers have come lately. They contain all sorts of play equipment and equipment that we use hauling out. We have a marvellous scheme called the Snug play equipment, which is kids can build out of these it's a modular construction process. This comes out about 3 times a week, and so a lot of kids use this area as their playground. And that brings in a lot of kids, but it's not like a fixed playground. Everything is flexible here. So it packs away into this, what we call this jeweled box, this container, and then there's another container over there. So they're crammed full of things that can come out for events in the square. One of the reasons why we got funding for this square, which is mainly central government funding and City Hall funding, but very little, it was topped up by the local authority. At virtually every turn, it wasn't at all clear whether we were going to be able to pull it off. There were moments when the funding got pulled, objections were made. The square wouldn't have been built but for the fact that the Vortex Jazz Club came here. It was regarded as a very important sort of catalyst for defining this place as a cultural space for Dalston, and so it's proved. The story about public space is capital sort of easy, but revenue difficult. When you add up the revenue costs of maintenance and keeping things going, and if you're talking about a cultural venue, It's open, there's no charging at all, so it's not a commercial proposition to be putting on arts events here. And so if you add those sums up over years, they're much greater than the actual capital. This has happened generally in England, is that there are these quite spectacular capital development projects, but they're not serviced with public money on the revenue side. And so it's been a struggle to keep things going. It is maintained, sort of maintained by the local authority and cleaned up every day and so on. But so there's a bit of basic maintenance that happens. Everything else is on a shoestring, on a project by project basis. So there's no core funding. And of course, this has left a bit of a vacuum. And this is one of the things that has been happening here over the last few years, is that the drug gangs have started to see this as a place to operate from. The police are not much in evidence these days because of the cards. I mean, there's been a sort of hot and cold sort of policing varying between zero tolerance and benign neglect, hoping that somehow we as community people would somehow manage the situation. And our position has always been no, there has to be a framework, a strong framework of where sanctions for illegal and criminal behaviour and antisocial behaviour are actually enforced, and that has to be done by the police. What really has to happen into maintaining these spaces is that there needs to be support for social projects and cultural projects in this square, and that's the only way in which, in the long run, we're going to deal with these issues.
If you live in Hackney, you're used to this. This is what Victoria Park's like, this is what it's like. And why shouldn't it be? Now, I can't say that we designed something, I wish I could, that is a certain shape that creates this. I think all that's happened is it's always been tolerant, and it hasn't been over-policed, if that's the right word, or over-managed. And that, I mean, the people that are in the pods, there has been a halal butcher, there's been hairdressers, there's been CD shops and DJs. So it's quite a tolerant, it's not, you know, it's not prissy and clean. It's always been quite messy and quite generous that way. And somehow that's kept the whole thing going.
One of the sad things, I would say, is that what has happened since around about 2000, the whole notion of social enterprise has actually come up as the solution, whereby businesses can be both in business and also contribute to the community. Now, that's not a bad idea per se, but frankly, I'd say that all businesses should be thought of as social enterprises. The problem that we're in is that social enterprise has been thought of as sort of a third sector where nice people and do nice things, where the big boys can get away with just go on doing the same stuff. What we should be arguing is that the developers moving into this area and the large corporates who are now benefiting from the regeneration that's taken place largely because of this. We've been sweet-talked by developers always in the early stages when they want to build something like what you see there. When they came in, they came to us and wanted us to approve of it, and we were promised all sorts of supports, but it just evaporates. The developers who are making money here don't give back what they should. And so, I mean, in the absence of public sector funding, which of course I think is necessary really if we're at all sane, but the pressure really has to come on the corporate sector who are making money here to really understand that the value here cannot be sustained. Small businesses, its diversity, the fact that this is an area where the socially and economically excluded can actually get a foothold. It's a place here which is very much a black space. It's not only, but it's a place where in the age of Windrush, it's the Windrush generation do gather here. And it's for basically ordinary people who are living in London, particularly living in east of London. But if it's going to be sustained, the private sector, which is now milking this situation, has to be persuaded or forced or inveigled to contribute. And that's not easy to achieve. At the moment, what we're facing is a major plan on this elevation here, which is to put 2 more stories on top actually demolish and get rid of these highly successful market pods and put a plastic skin all the way up and over, and it will obliterate, in fact, the Victorian back end of this street, which it was a street, but it will also give it a contemporary look.
HCD have managed to attract funding to Hackney. That's what it's about. You know, they've got funding from the GLA to basically redo the original Bradbury Street, which was done a bit on a shoestring. It is a bit leaky and it's very hard to keep it warm and secure. So there's a new building which is designed by Alex Smith. He's designed a lovely building which is quite straightforward but has lots of windows this way, and in fact they're having to take out the pods initially and they're looking at ways of trying to reuse them, but it's going to have the same shop fronts all the way round, and in fact it'll have more shop fronts and there'll be more space. And then in the temporary state they're building new pods, although they're probably going to be more containers, they're shipping containers on this side, so all the tenants can move out. And they've been, in a nice way, he's carried on the tradition of properly consulting everybody, so that him and Meg, Alex and Meg, have been meeting people here.
The traders, yeah, there's a certain amount of anxiety around the redevelopment because there's uncertainty as to how it's all going to work. As I've said, there was a certain amount of protest when the initial plans came through, because the initial plans had them replacing the market pods with one big long open space. So instead of there being space for individual traders, it was just going to be one big long space. The community came out in protest of that, in support of keeping these traders here and operational. And as a result, I believe the redesign plans now involve one big long open space, but that's been kind of cut into smaller spaces where the market traders can go. The plan so far is to have a rent control for 2 years. But I think there's a certain amount of anxiety as to what will happen after that time. You know, will they just increase the rents? And just in general, you know, the square is filled with just anxiety around the gentrification that's happening in the neighborhood, and how to retain the special vibrant community that has been created here. No one wants to lose that, and it's sort of tricky times.
It comes back to the simple economics. Unless you have vast amounts of subsidy going in, you can't do it. So basically it's a wrong-headed way. What you can do, and it's very sinister in a way, you can get rid of the problem people, if there are problem people who are committing crimes, or there's drunkenness and drug addiction and so on, and they gather here and so on, and even if some of the tenants won't go and are behaving badly, you can solve all those problems by a redevelopment, a physical redevelopment, and that's simply a form of gentrification and displacement. What we need here are social and cultural projects to work with the people here, with all the issues and problems that are here. So basically, we don't need another capital development project on this site. This works very well, but we do need social and cultural projects well supported, and that's where we should be going. The whole area is frankly under threat. But there may be an interregnum because of the housing market downturn that we're experiencing now. Developers are not in quite, and Brexit and everything else. There is a sense in which we're at an interesting period now, because perhaps many of these high-profit private sector initiatives for this very specific area, shall we just say, on hold at the moment, in which case that does give us a bit of a space in which alternative plans, genuine alternative plans, which really take the inspiration of what's worked here and push it on further, could happen. So in some sense, the next 5 years could be quite interesting if the private sector doesn't manage to eat this up. But there is a very real threat. What is this doing here, one might ask, from a developer's point of view, right in the heart of a town centre, a community space where not-for-profits operate, where artists operate, where crazies operate, where people skateboard, all sorts of things happen.
when we won the awards for the pods, me and Adam went on a sort of speaking tour, and we went to these big retail conferences with Sainsbury's and Tesco, which is very odd. And I can't remember what, this quite a while ago now, but we had a series of rules, and we were trying to say, one of the things we said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, was one main rule. And I think we very much said that there is plenty of cultural life here. There are Turkish restaurants, and there's Ridley Road Market, and there's music, and there's the jazz clubs, and that's a very Hackney thing. So to a certain extent, you should start with those and build round them. You shouldn't clear it and then say, okay, we're going to have a Sainsbury's and a Tesco.
We really want to learn from this space because there aren't really a lot of 20-year-old regeneration projects of this kind. Also, in a lot of the new spaces that have been created in recent years, they have private policing, private security, and this doesn't. It's very much an open place where people can come and do what they like. That is the spirit of Gillett Square, and I feel like that's quite unique in the city. There's very few places that are new and that really you can come and skateboard or sit or even drink, it's also available for events. I think it's quite inexpensive to hire. It also has a lot of things that other squares are doing now, like improvisational child play. I mean, that kind of started here too. I think this is quite an early example of a public living room.
I think there's a lot of focus nowadays on trying to understand how to create community and successful community spaces where communities come together. And here in Gillett, we have one. We have an incredibly vibrant, dynamic, fun community that represents the diversity of its neighborhood. I think these pods, an analysis of these pods, has really helped us to understand how they contribute to that. In redesigning them, I think we have a lot to learn from them in terms of the features that contribute to that, and how to not sort of just think that a community will pop up out of nowhere. It takes a lot of work, it takes the right people, it takes the right environment, it takes the right spaces, and it would be a shame to lose that understanding moving forward.
If it was going to have changed, it would have changed. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think that all the housing around here has happened and it hasn't changed this. And people like it like this, all the people walking through. And there's a balance, isn't there? I think it's busy enough that it feels safe. There's a balance point. Now you have to feel safe and confident. It's a city space. It's not you see all different cultures and all different behaviours here, and you have to deal with that, but actually it's quite busy and it's not empty. It's not White City, is it? It's not Stratford. And so all these people chose it because it's like this.
We need to persuade the state and the private sector that actually in the long run that it is in their interests to see this not demolished, not transformed into something else, but built on for what it is.